Listen, thanks very much for listening to me. I think I'm supposed to talk for about 45 minutes, so I'll try to stick to that time. I want to especially thank Laura and Lucy for all of the great work that they've been doing over the whole year and before that. Yes, you can give them a round of applause. Sorry, I know it's a very loud, audience over here. Apologies for that at home, but yeah, congratulations to them for doing this work and trying to do something. A lot of us care about things, but not a lot of us actually take the initiative to do things about the things that we care about. But here we have an example of two colleagues who have taken the initiative to create something, and through creating something, they have had an impact and brought people together. So I really admire that and appreciate that. So thank you so much. So as you can see, the title of this talk is Decolonisation Under Attack, and I'm going to talk about pushback and potential within higher education. And of course, I don't know so much about this field. I mean, this is a broad field and there's many people who know many things about it. And some people have read some things and experienced some things. And so everyone has something to bring to this conversation. And that's why I'll look forward to hearing other people's contributions later. And hopefully what I'm going to do is just stimulate some discussion by trying to say a few things that maybe are interesting or maybe not. We'll see how it goes. So look, one of the first questions that we come to when we talk about decolonisation is what even is decolonisation? What does it actually mean? I mean, to some people, it seems like it's obvious. Some people might even assume that they know what it means and that everybody understands what it means. I think the slides have disappeared from the projector. I'm not sure how to rectify that. I'm just going to continue, and I'm going to hope that the way that I'm communicating will be sufficient for you to understand what I'm saying, and you won't need to rely on the slides. The main thing is I can see the slides because that's basically serving as my notes. So as I was saying, we might assume that we know what decolonisation means, but actually what I'd like to start off by saying to you is that, some of you know this and some of you might not have appreciated this yet. Decolonisation means different things to different people. Decolonisation is understood differently in different contexts, and that's obvious to some of us, but for those of you or others who it's not obvious to, this is a really important point to become aware of, because if you're not aware of it, you might come to think that decolonisation has this limited, narrow view. So what I've done here is I've tried to list some of the ways in which decolonisation is spoken about in different spaces. Some people focus on one of these issues, some people focus on multiple issues, but not all of them. I guess that the ideal situation is to have an awareness of the different dimensions that decolonisation has. So, for example, we start off very commonly by thinking about key concepts like Eurocentrism, the obsession with having a Eurocentric, or you could say a European or a Western perspective, or some people say a Northern or a Northern-centric perspective, and that dominating the questions that we ask and the answers that we give and the things that we prioritize and the things that we think are most valuable. We talk about key concepts like Orientalism when we talk about decolonisation, and Orientalism, as I think most of you are familiar with, is about trying to understand how throughout historical processes the West has imagined the East, or the Occident has imagined the Orient, and often in disparaging ways and in ways that looked down upon and patronized the other who was seen as barbaric or uncivilized or backward. And so this is another thing that we're trying to put to the forefront when we talk about decolonisation, because we want to undo this legacy of Orientalism, which we say is a historical legacy, which was fostered in this colonial era, but still remains today. And then we might even talk about things like Anglocentrism, which takes us to a more linguistic territory as something else that needs to be thought about in terms of which languages dominate and which languages are the most popular and the most valued. Of course, there's another dimension, which is racism and xenophobia. This is for some people the be all and end all of decolonisation, but like I'm trying to show you, it's not actually, in my understanding, what decolonisation is solely about. Yes, it is part of the discussion because racism and xenophobia is one of the significant legacies that comes from that era of colonialism, or which remains in the era of colonialism. And so this is something that people are keen to draw attention to when they talk about decolonisation. And I think for us in this discussion, we're mostly talking about decolonising the university, but of course, as we've said earlier today in our event here in York, sometimes we also want to make sure, or not sometimes, all the time, we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that the world is not the university. There are other decolonial discussions to be had beyond the university, in the so-called real world, as they put it. So this is another aspect, and specifically here in the university, we're thinking about racism and xenophobia in the university, which some people don't like to imagine as a problem, because supposedly universities are enlightened spaces, diverse spaces, progressive spaces, spaces where people are generally more educated than other places and spaces. But actually, I wrote an article, and the title of the article is called "The Myth of Academic Tolerance." And the reason it's called that is because I'm trying to say that, we have this perception that academia is a tolerant space. But actually, I think, and, it's not just me thinking this, but there's lots of research that shows this is somewhat of a myth. Yes, to some extent, there is positive things that happen, and there are some progressive spaces and progressive instances. But actually, it's a myth to believe that all of academia is tolerant, because actually that's not the case at all. So we also talk in these decolonial discussions about underrepresentation of particular groups, marginalized groups. We talk about discrimination. It's related, of course, to racism, but this is the way in which it might operate in terms of affecting people's opportunities. But we also recognize when someone is held back from having opportunities, other people might be given the opportunities. And so this is captured by this term of privilege. Curricula is a big part of discussions when it comes to decolonization for some people. Also citations, like what's cited. So what is taught, what is cited, what is given a platform, basically, and what, conversely, what isn't given a platform, what is silenced, as it says there. Some people are worried about, as it says there, pedagogical parochialism, which means how teaching, sounds like a really fancy word, but it basically just means how teaching can be quite narrow and how it can be not very expansive in delivering a type of teaching that really works for all of the students that might be present in an educational space. So some people really want to focus on how teaching is done, not what is taught, but how things are taught. Research is another thing that happens in universities, of course, alongside things like teaching and relationships and opportunities. There's also research, of course, and there's lots of discussion and concern about research in this decolonial paradigm, because there's a belief that research can be, it's supposed to be like a good thing. Research is supposed to expand knowledge. It's supposed to give us new understandings and new awareness. And often it does. And, there's many great success stories of research, of course. But we also have to admit, according to this decolonial paradigm, that research can be dangerous. Research can be harmful. Research might do more harm than good, and particularly towards particular communities and those who are, ostracized in various ways. Some people are quite interested in what we might call symbolic violence in the campus, in the university atmosphere. And symbolic violence, it's referring to a type of aggression, if you like, or a type of hostility, which is not necessarily like a physical aggression, but one that is caused by, for example, certain statues, certain symbols, certain buildings being named with certain names. This is a type of symbolic violence, which some people don't care about. And some people say this is just, snowflake generation complaining about everything. But actually, there is harms that are enacted and harms that are committed on that hurts people, that damages people, maybe even traumatizes people. And some people don't want to admit that, but it's interesting that it's not difficult to find examples to present to those people who oppose that point and show them symbols that if I was to attack them or spit on them or burn them or present them, they will be horrified by. So what I'm trying to say is no matter what group you belong to, if you're left wing, right wing, pro this, anti this, woke, unwoke, or whatever the opposite of woke is, there's always symbols. There's no group that doesn't have a symbol that isn't sacred, or there's no group that doesn't have a symbol that isn't going to be offensive. So you can think for yourself, what are the examples of those people who might tell us that a certain statue on campus is irrelevant and stop being so sensitive? What symbols might offend them if they were present, or what symbols, if they were harmed, might also offend them? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, whether we like it or not, whether we want to say that this should or shouldn't happen, people get hurt through symbols being present or symbols being defaced. That's just the way that the world works, because symbols matter to humans. Whether it's a flag, for example, just to give you another example, could be a flag. It could be a symbol of a certain conflict. It could be something like a national symbol, a figurehead of a nation, for example, or a religion. There's different symbols that come to be prominent, and campuses are full of symbols, and therefore some people are worried about symbolic violence because some symbols cause injury to some people. So also there's a lot of discussion about neo-colonialism, meaning the ongoing ways in which colonialism still manifests today, and same for imperialism and neo-imperialism, which could be, for example, in terms of relationships that universities have with certain organizations or industries, or even what universities do in certain countries in terms of what they're developing and what sort of opportunities they're trying to take advantage of. There's also discussions about historical injustice and how that still benefits universities, and whether reparations are necessary, or whether it's something that should just be forgotten, for example. And then finally, there's also a point here about local communities. So you have to look on a case-by-case basis at each university, but a lot of universities are like inner city universities, meaning they're in spaces where there either were communities previously that were pushed out for the university to grow, to colonize, if you want to put it like that, or are in areas where, inner city areas on the most part in the UK, not always, of course, and it depends, but often universities are near to relatively deprived communities. And not all. I don't know about this university, and I don't know about your university, but in many spaces, the poorer communities live near to the university. And this is a concern for people from the decolonial perspective, because the question is, what is the university doing for those people? What is it not doing for those people? Is it open to those people? Is it close to those people? Is it part of the community? Is it an imposition? Is it something which, again, like I said about research, potentially causes more harm than good? I'm not sure if you know people who live near universities who don't have an affiliation with the university, but if you speak to such people, as I have done in various capacities, some of them, in some instances, have lots of complaints to make about the university, not only the university as an institution, but the people who are present in the university, meaning usually academics, students, and maybe other staff or visitors, because of the disruption that this entity causes for the local community. And, that could be in terms of rent prices, for example. It could be in terms of certain behavior. It could be in terms of, what do they call it? The gentrification of food outlets. Yeah, like in some universities, the cost of food is really high because there's a certain sort of middle class expectation for certain types of catering, and when you have that amount of that expectation, it can make it harder for people from the local community to afford to eat in those spaces, for example. So of course, this is a case-by-case basis, and it's something which you can look at. Anyway, this is an overview just to show you, just to reiterate what I said to you. My point was that decolonization, it's got many different facets. It's not just one thing. And like I said, the ideal situation is that we pay attention to all of these things. But in reality, what happens is some people focus on specific things. Some people are really passionate, for example, about the symbols on campuses, and that's their project. But that's fine, I think. But what's probably not fine is sort of dismissing the other elements, because the other elements also matter, and this is all part of a broader package. Okay, moving on. So, probably have I finished 45 minutes yet? Probably on the first slide. Sorry about this. So I just get carried away with this stuff, and I get really drawn into it, and kind of like eager to preach about all this stuff because it kind of matters. But anyway, look, I think it's interesting to ask ourselves, where does this decolonial movement come from? How did it come about? Because it's relatively recently, and I'm probably saying like in the last decade, that decolonization has become so popular. More than a decade ago, some of us were in universities and we were studying or we were working. And I'm not sure if you would agree with this, but my memory and my understanding is that a decade ago, we weren't really using the term decolonization. Some people were, and there are books. So I'm not saying it didn't exist. I'm not saying it's brand new, but we were talking more in terms of like, critical race theory was popular, post-colonialism was popular, postmodernism was popular, although not many people speak about this anymore. So there were other trends and ways of speaking about such issues. But of course, it became more popular, very popular, in fact. I think if you look at the publications and the books and things that have been published about decolonization, you'll clearly see a huge increase in the last decade, which supports what I'm trying to say. So what is interesting, if we want to understand decolonization, is to think about what's the background story, that how we came about it. And basically what I would like to claim, and I'm open for you to have a different understanding, and I'd love to hear about that. But my understanding is that I've arrived at is this, that the intellectual genealogy, meaning the origins of this intellectual movement, is a mixture of all these different paradigms that came before. And if we want to have a really good understanding of decolonial thinking, we need to go back to those origin movements or paradigms, because they're forming the foundations that got to ask, led to us asking the questions that we're asking now. So all those points I just put on the previous slide, they didn't just start 10 years ago, and they're not just new. These are things that relate to discussions that have been happening before, just in different frames or in different dialects, if I can put it like that. And so in particular, like I said, post-colonialism, it's a branch of scholarship that if some people are interested in decolonial work might say, actually, decolonial work is different from post-colonial stuff, and I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in decolonial. Actually, not only am I not interested, but I'm actually hostile to it. This is the type of perspective that some people have. My perspective is different from that. My perspective is, if you really want to have a good understanding of decolonial scholarship, it's very important to appreciate the post-colonial scholarship that preceded it, and that, arguably still continues to grow today, because that is part of the same conversation. And decolonial perspectives might not be where they are today without that whole body of work, which was really important. But some people, their understanding, and you can form your own opinion about this, some people's understanding is that, no, post-colonialism and decolonial scholarship is different, and we need to choose one or the other because they clash and they contest. And maybe they do clash in some ways, but in my understanding, that doesn't mean that you will just dismiss one or the other, because every paradigm has its limitations, has things that it doesn't see, and it needs to be complemented by others. I also put feminist scholarship in there, because feminist scholarship, and there's a lot to say about this, but we don't have time. Feminist scholarship, in my understanding, has had an influence on decolonial perspectives, because some of the things that people ask or talk about when it comes to decolonial perspectives is echoing what feminist scholars were telling us maybe in the 70s, and were telling us or in the 80s, and were telling us very articulately and powerfully. So, for example, I might talk about this later, when it comes to research. Yeah, my understanding is that decolonial research, as it is talked about today, is very much echoing feminist research as it was spoken about in the 1980s. It's very similar, the principles, if you compare what were feminist scholars saying about research in the 80s, what a decolonial scholar saying in the 2020s about research is very similar. So I think we have to acknowledge that. There's indigenous scholarship as well, which is predominantly that which is found in places like USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Some people merge this with decolonial scholarship. That's fine. I see it as having a slightly different focus and a slightly different lineage of its own. And there's all the critical race theory stuff as well, which is very important for understanding how we got to be where we got. But significantly, I think if we want to understand all this, we don't only need to look at the intellectual tradition, but also the activist tradition, because, as I think you know, this whole decolonial thing, one of the big reasons why it's become so popular today is because of student activism, in particular in places like the UK, but also in places like South Africa and other countries. Student activism, and also activism from outside of universities, has been very important in getting us to where we are. It's not just a movement that has been shaped within academia. So look, like I said to you, right, there's this whole backstory of decolonization, and there's so many figures that I can talk about to you, where I can say, look, you have to pay attention to, for example, Frantz Fanon, for example, one of the most prominent thinkers, or we could talk about Ali Shariati, or we could talk about Syed Hussein Alatas, or Jose Rizal, or Edward Said, or, there's so many other thinkers that you know, and you know them better than I know them. And we can say all these thinkers were talking about things that are still relevant for the discussions that we're having today. And we need to go back to them to try and understand how they, with their brilliant intellect, theorize these questions, because they will help us to understand how we might deal with such problems today. But there's one person I'm going to mention here, and I'm mentioning him for a couple of reasons. And I suppose one of them is, I guess I'll say it like this. One of them is because he's not spoken about very often, and many people do not know about him. But the second reason, I think it's also because, as we know in recent times, the politics and the conflicts and the wars and all these things that are going on, what we know about these kind of things is that, and this is true for not only just like contemporary war, but colonialism and colonial wars, is that one of the ways in which that is justified and legitimized is on the basis that the other, or those who are seen as the bad guys, are dehumanized and are seen as inferior and are seen as lacking. And I can just pause there. Lacking in what? Lacking in everything. Lacking in electricity, in homes, in cars, in poetry, in love, in children, in football devotion, they're just lacking. So I'm specifically mentioning Ali Ahmed because he was Iranian, and as we know, there's this whole thing about Iran and what is Iran, and oh my God, and like if you say people, do you want to go to Iran for a holiday? Like, oh my God, what are you talking about? I don't even want to fly over Iran. Never mind go into the country. But the people who go to Iran, and I know many people who've done that who are not Iranian, they come back with a different perception. They're like, oh my God, that was the most hospitable country I've gone to. The people are so nice. The civilizational history is so fascinating. The love for poetry is something that I've never experienced in other contexts before. So that's another reason, I suppose, that I chose to talk about Ali Ahmed, just to humanize a context which is very much at the present moment thoroughly dehumanized. But also, like I said, because Ali Ahmed is someone who's neglected, and what I'm trying to emphasize to you, why am I talking about him? I'm trying to make the point, like I said to you a moment ago, that this conversation has been going on a long time. We're not the originators of this conversation, especially not those of us who are like from the North or the West or from these like special universities. We didn't make this, we didn't find this issue. Yeah, we didn't initiate this conversation. And if we join this conversation without acknowledging the people who've been having that conversation, especially those from the South, if we can use that word. I know earlier today someone said they don't like that word, but I know there's no perfect term, but I'll just use that for now. If we don't acknowledge those people from the South, then perhaps we're reinforcing a very colonial mindset ourselves by sort of saying, by the way, we've discovered this thing called colonialism, and at the same time, we're ignoring the people, whether they were in the Caribbean or they were in Latin America or they're in wherever they were in the world, who were talking about these things years ago. And so here you go, Ali Ahmed, 1962, published a book, Occidentosis, A Plague from the West. It's not perfect. It's not without flaws. It's not something that I fully subscribe to, but there's interesting ideas in there, which reminds me, as someone from the global North, that this conversation that I'm trying to get involved in has been happening for a very long time in places that are supposedly lacking. And it's not lacking, and this is one example of it. So Ali Ahmed popularized this term, Khabzadige, Occidentosis, as it's translated into, or sometimes it's translated in, like, not, instead of, that's the literal translation, sometimes it's translated to West struckness or West toxification. And what it means is, he's introduced this term in his book, where he's trying to say that there are some people in the East or the non-West or the global South who are so like infatuated by the West that they're desperate to be Western. They're desperate to emulate. They think all the answers comes from the West, and they want to almost be infected by this supposed superior way of being and way of existing. And he wants to draw attention to this because he's saying that in this neo-colonial context that he was living in and experiencing, it's a context where there's Western exploitation and extraction from the East in different ways. It could be, materially, it could be politically, it could be spiritually, perhaps. It could even be intellectually or epistemically. And so he's interested in these kinds of exploitation, but he's also interested in the dependency of such spaces on the West. And this is important for me because sometimes in some decolonial discussions, there's a lot of discussion about the West did this, the West is that, the North is this. But some of these scholars like Ali Ahmed or, for example, Said Hussein Alatas is another good example. He talks about the captive mind. Yeah, even Frantz Fanon, as I think you know, when he talks, he doesn't just talk about the problem of the West. His problem is also the problem of us, or those of the South, those who were dominated, those who were colonized. And this is what Ali Ahmed is trying to emphasize, that there's a problem, and the problem doesn't only exist from what they do, it also exists, as he's saying, from what we do. And that's important because it takes us to another dimension that isn't always acknowledged in decolonial discussions. So in particular, he was critical of educational institutions in his home country, Iran, because he felt that they taught in a Eurocentric and an Occidentotic manner, meaning an obsessed way, like very obsessed with the West. They've kind of internalized Eurocentrism, if I'm to simplify it. He's concerned about how people in the non-West, or in Iran in his specific case, might internalize an inferiority complex. Okay, I think you get what I mean. And that leads him to call for more independence, more autonomy, more self-sufficiency. And all of this is relevant to what we said about the university, the way the university operates. And that's why he refers to this as an intellectual seesaw, saying that, a seesaw, as you know, is like that thing that children play on. And the seesaw is imbalanced in one way, and it's imbalanced in that the Eurocentric perspective is getting more weight or more sort of intellectual investment than it should, and he wants to even out the seesaw. Okay. So we might criticize his work as lacking nuance in some parts. I think that would be like a reasonable thing to say. You might say it's overly polemical and it's not, sophisticated enough. But nonetheless, as I said, I think we should pay attention to his work and others like him, even though we would still critique his work, because it's important, isn't it? Just because someone says they're decolonial or they're anti-racist or they're pro-justice, it doesn't mean we don't criticize their work. I'm not for the sake of just like trying to look clever or try to put them down, but obviously the decolonial work that we engage with, we don't just engage with it like wholeheartedly supporting everything. We criticize it. We want to be rigorous. We want to hold it to account. And so we should criticize some of the ideas if you engage in them more. I've just given you the foundations of what you're saying, but if you go in detail, you might find some elements that you don't agree with or that could be elaborated on and so on. So if we pay attention to this kind of work, I think it'll help us to better understand where we're at. Okay. So look, someone asked me to mention this, and like I don't know, it's a bit weird mentioning your own work, but I'm just going to say it anyway because it's on the slide, and it gave me a chance to tell you something about something I wrote, which you might find interesting. So the point I want to make here, and I'm not doing great with time if I'm honest with you. The point I want to make here is as follows, right? When we talk about decolonization, sometimes, especially as we've talked about earlier today, there are echo chambers and silos, and like all of us in this room, this packed out room, like I can see at the top, everywhere the people that are here. What we might realize is that we're all quite similar in our principles and our beliefs. But what we might forget is that actually not everyone agrees with decolonization. Not everybody supports it. And all I wanted to say here, I'm just going to go really, really fast. All I wanted to say is that sometimes there are people criticizing decolonization who are allies of decolonization or who are decolonial people themselves. So that might mean that person A is like a decolonial activist and person B is a decolonial activist. And A might criticize B because they might see B's effort at decolonization as insufficient, inadequate, and maybe even dangerous. But we don't always recognize. Sometimes we think that anyone who's doing something decolonial should be celebrated, but actually there's an increasing tendency within this paradigm, if we can call it a group or a community, the decolonial community, if we can say such a thing, there is increasing tendency, it's growing, it's becoming very popular, that different parts of this community are criticizing other parts. And this is dangerous in a way because, people talk about solidarity and unity. However, this is very normal when it comes to intellectual movements, because what we always see with intellectual movements is as they grow, they splinter and they fragment. And that seems dangerous, like I said, but actually it's probably a good thing because it helps push along the dialogue. That's why when we talk about feminism, for example, people say first wave feminism, second wave feminism. It's like a wave. It's like a different, people talk about, I don't know, Marxists or neo-Marxists or, different types of Marxists that have developed over the years as people became more aware of different criticisms within the community. So I'm still asking myself, and I'm still wondering, I'm not sure if you have any answers. Have we reached a second wave of decolonial theory? Did we already have that? Which wave are we up to? Are we in the first wave? Are some places and people already ahead in other waves? Like, how do we demarcate? I wrote this other article when I talked about whiteness, critical whiteness studies, and I tried to demarcate the different waves of critical whiteness studies. And I was able to do that based on mapping how the discussions evolved. Like at one point it was about this, then there was more of a focus on like white privilege as a key concept. Then there was more of a focus on whiteness in non-Western contexts, for example. So we see certain trends in fields, and this is an interesting project for someone to work on if you agree that this is a worthwhile initiative. And the project is to try to chart where are we up to in the evolution of decolonial thought, because it's not static. Or is it static? Are we stuck? Are we stuck and are we waiting for the next step? And who's going to take the next step and what's it going to be? What's the focus going to be? So I'm trying to say that we need to not only embrace what is around us, but we need to also be prepared to go with the flow of that intellectual movement, but not only expect others to do that for us, but those of us who think we're decolonial, have to be responsible for pushing forward that discussion And that's not one person's job. And it's not, there's some leaders in the field, prominent people who are known and who get cited a lot and stuff like that. You can't rely on them. Maybe that was the older generation. Maybe there's another generation who's coming through who've got different perspectives and different understanding. Some of the people who might be leaders might be of a particular age and they might not be as familiar with, let's say, social media. Maybe they're not as familiar with some pop cultural references that, need to be accommodated for, or how the world's changing, or generation this or that. So sometimes we're relying on the figures who have been the figureheads. But what I'm trying to say is that's inadequate, because we need new figureheads. We need to move along. So the young generation, like me, why are you laughing? So I'm joking, don't worry. So the next generation, whoever that is, maybe I'm the older generation already, I don't know. But the next generation it needs to keep asking the questions and pushing along, rather than just, because we have this kind of celebrity thing with some academics and this like obsession and glorification, and it's not really intellectually beneficial to have such an approach, I think. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, I'm just going to skip through. Look, what I want to say here is that not only are there people criticizing decolonization who are quite like a fan of decolonization but think it could be done better, but there are also people who are within universities and who are somewhat allies to some of the principles of decolonization, who are becoming even more sort of almost dismissive, or almost like ready to move on, almost ready to say, listen, this decolonial thing, it's had its day, it's exaggerated, it's not the best framework, we need to move on. And there was some points here about that, if you get to see it. There's some points here about how some people are really quite critical. I mean, if you take the last point there about Larson and Chetty and their critique, they've got this interview they did together online, but there's two things there that is referenced that they wrote separately. And the way that they speak about some of the leading proponents of decolonization, it's really harsh, if you want to say it in that way, or really powerful, if you want to say it in another way, but it's really firm. It's not holding back. So the movement, if you like, is splintering. But like I said, I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. I see that as something positive, because it pushes us forward. Right, look, I'm sorry for the title of my other article, which I was also asked to mention, but I wrote this other article, which was recently published. You can check it out if you're interested. The point here is just to say that decolonization is not only being spoken about in universities, but there's also discussions about decolonization happening outside of universities, and especially in the media, and especially in the right-wing media, and also, I guess, in social media. And in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that, as it says there, I would suggest, or my research indicated, that there's a moral panic, and I guess most of you know what that term means. It just basically means there's a sort of exaggerated fear. There's an exaggerated fear or a sensationalism about decolonization in universities as something dangerous. It's seen as like this conspiracy to like undermine the West, or to take over, or to conquer, or something like that. So we have to acknowledge that that sentiment exists out there beyond the university. I think we need to confront that. Some people never talk about that who are in universities, because they have very little connection with what's going on outside of universities, because we spend all our time in the university, all our time talking to academics, maybe like-minded academics. This is concerning, because if we really care about the issues that we've talked about earlier, we can't just stop at the university, but we have to confront the discourses that exist outside of the university. But how to do that, and when to do that, and what are the repercussions of doing that, is another matter, and we can talk more about that later if we have time. Right, look. So I've totally, I don't know how I really messed up with this time thing. I should have just done 2 slides. Next time, 45 minutes is 2 slides. That's what I've taught myself. Okay, look, I wanted to talk about teaching, and I wanted to talk about research, and I wanted to talk about writing. And what I just wanted to say is that there are things that can be done. I haven't lost full faith in decolonization. I have days when I'm like skeptical, and days when I'm frustrated with all this effort, especially when we challenge these kind of things. Sometimes you feel like you work so hard, like there's people in this room who really devoted to this issue. They really care about this issue, and they work really hard on it. And they put like a lot of effort trying to think about it, understand it, read literature, write things, go and speak about it, change their practice. And then sometimes something happens in the news, or something happens in politics, or there's some like incident in the university or something, and you feel like, you've gone, as they say, 1 step forward and 10 steps back, because, the things that are happening are not in our control, really. We can only do what we can do. But ultimately, as individual academics, or even as a group of us, we're relatively powerless I don't know if this is too cynical, and I'm sorry if it is, but I think it's true. We're relatively powerless compared to like the media or certain, influential spokespeople in the world who, with one tweet or one post or one speech, can undo a lot of the good work that people who are trying to, make positive changes can do. So sometimes you get very frustrated. But what I'm trying to say is not really to be that cynical. I'm trying to be more optimistic. And I'm trying to say, or what I was going to say if I didn't put too much content in these slides, is I was going to basically say there are still things that we can do, right? So for example, when it comes to teaching, if we're educators here, some of us are and some of us aren't, if we teach students, you can, some people saying, they said this earlier today, it's not just about diversifying your reading list. I think that's true. But personally, and I don't mind if you disagree about this, I think diversifying your reading list is a significant thing to do. I think it is a step in the right direction. It is something that we should be doing. It's not the be all and end all, and it's not the only thing that we should be wanting to do. But trying to teach students that, like I said, do you know there are thinkers in Iran? Yeah, that sounds like a strange thing to say, but for some people, like, what? Really? Do you know there are sociologists in Africa, for example? Do you know that there are social theorists who came from Japan who spoke about the Japanese context and who said things that might be interesting for us? Do you know in the Philippines that there is a vibrant intellectual community who produce research which we should pay attention to and we might learn from? Yeah, these things exist, but many people don't care. Like a lot of the teaching I see in universities is very UK centric, and at most it's US centric. Like we teach, if I generalize, we teach our students US and UK. This is the only countries in the world. But we can diversify our reading lists and our curriculum and our lecture slides. And I think this is a step in the right direction. So there's some space to do that, even if it's not, the only thing that we try to do. And I was going to say things about how we teach as well, how we interact with students. There's also things that we can do there differently. In terms of research, I wanted to talk about how there are also things that we can do when it comes to research. And I was going to try and explain to you that when it comes to research, that the key, it's not always clear. Like if I say, what is decolonial research? Or if someone says, I want to use a decolonial research method, then the question you might ask them is, what does that mean? Like, what is that? Like if you say, I want to interview, I know what that means. If you say, I want to do a discourse analysis, I kind of got a sense of what you mean by that. But if you say I'm using decolonial theory to inform the epistemology and ontology of my research project, you might be like, well, what do you mean by that? So I've tried to boil this down and figure out like what is decolonial research like at the most basic level or the most universal level. And what I came to kind of suggest is that decolonial research is really about trying to undo colonialism, whatever the legacy of that is, whatever harms that it caused. But also a common feature of it is to recognize that traditional research has been harmful for people who are marginalized by colonialism. And one of the key, most common methods that is used in decolonial research is the notion of co-collaboration, the notion of working together with communities so that the researcher is not the owner and the director of the research, but that it's done somewhat equitably and with more consultation and with giving back to the community more than what traditional research would be, how traditional research would be done. So this is a rough sense of what decolonial research at its most basic general level is. So I wanted to say, look, there's space to do decolonial research. If you want to do a research project, you should, I think, if you're a good researcher, pause and ask yourself, how am I going to do this research? And in particular, it depends what type of research you're doing, but some studies more than others, depending on the content and the topic and the focus, really lend themselves well to thinking about doing research in this way. And just like we might, I guess as a social science researcher, it would seem strange to me if I did a research project where I just didn't consider gender. Like how can you not consider gender in a world where gender is so important, right? Gender is shaping so many things in the world and so many experiences and so many ways in which people are categorized and organized that we can't not think about gender in a research project, even if it's not the main focus. We have to consider. And so what I'd like to say is that when it comes to doing research, I think it's become more common, but not common enough, that nowadays people are also thinking about what about the colonial context? What about how this relates to North-South dynamics? What about how this relates to racism or xenophobia. Like, we can't overlook that. And so this is one of the things, again, if we want to be a bit optimistic, asking, can we still do decolonial stuff? Well, I think there is some stuff that can be done, even though I also wanted to recognize that there are still ways in which, even if you try hard to engage in decolonial research, you might find that you still can't equalize the relationships, because maybe you as the researcher still has, as some group calls it, the power of the last word, meaning you get to be the one who decides what is published eventually, or what is said, or what is shared, or you get invited to give the talks. So decolonial research is not without its limitations, and this doesn't just apply for the research, it applies to the teaching and the curriculum. If you say that you're doing decolonial stuff in the university, even if you're really trying hard, like every type of intellectual endeavor, there are always going to be limitations or complexities or things that still need more thought and still need to be carefully managed. And I think we also need to admit that sometimes that the research or the teaching that we do might even, like I said earlier, might even cause more harm than good, just like the traditional research did. You know, sometimes we think we are being anti-racist, but we might go into a space and enforce or enact racism. So good intentions doesn't prevent us from causing more harm than what there was before we started. You know, the analogy I used in another talk was about my DIY, for example. Right, so it's better sometimes. Like the DIY is in my home, it's supposed to improve the house. It's supposed to fix the house, but sometimes I'm making it worse. You know, I've got a dripping tap in my kitchen. It's been dripping for months, and I thought, you know, I'm like going to try and fix this thing. I borrowed a big wrench from someone, and I was like, couldn't figure out how to take the tap off and stuff like that. And eventually I managed to get it off, and like water was everywhere, and I just figured out how to switch the water off. But when I was like, I couldn't fix what I put a new washer, and I thought, yep, I looked on YouTube. I put the tap back on. The drip is worse now than it was before I started, and I can't even call it a drip anymore. It's more like a stream almost. So you get the point that I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that just like Leon's DIY might make the problem worse, when I go into the research space and say, right, don't worry everybody, I'm here to do decolonial research, I'm here to decolonize, I might actually reproduce or reinforce colonialism. And this is a real serious danger, because it's easy, remember, for us to sit here and say, look at all those Eurocentric academics who are not here. Look at all of that Eurocentric research and teaching that our colleagues are doing. I'm aware of that, so that's not a problem for me. But actually, it might be just as bad or even worse, you know, based on the way that we're approaching this decolonial stuff. So that's what I wanted to say here. I also wanted to talk to you. I think we're almost out of time. I also wanted to say something about writing, because, you know, writing is another thing that a lot of academics do. You know, we do the teaching, we do the research side of things, but then we come to publish things as well. And when it comes to writing, what I really wanted to elaborate on, sorry, I'll put the points in case you'd rather read them than listen to me. What I wanted to say is, again, you know, there's problems with writing. There's ways in which coloniality or colonialism manifests in writing, manifests in the publishing industry. Like we talked about earlier, there's certain languages that are prioritized, there's certain ways of speaking, ways of communicating. You know, like, for example, I used to live in Singapore, and in Singapore they call it Singlish. Singlish is like, you know, an amalgamation of English, but also other dialects and other languages from the region and that have been in Singapore for a long time. And there's a really interesting debate in Singapore about the legitimacy of Singlish. Is it a legitimate way of communicating, or is it improper? Is it not the right way of speaking? Can you write in Singlish? Can you write academic papers in Singlish? It's seen as like a street language, like a market language, like an informal home language. And you have to speak so-called proper English. So, you know, and this exists in many countries, doesn't it? In many post-colonial societies, there's this tension between like proper English or standard English, or it could be French or whatever, and local dialects. And so, you know, there's interesting questions about how do we write and what do we write. But at the same time, there are some people out there who are saying that, you know, while writing might be liberating, it might even help us decolonize. Some people might feel that writing is not the priority. Writing is a distraction. Writing is a privilege. You know, I really always find it powerful and fascinating when Trin says that those who are scholars or writers or maybe even poets in some communities get seen as a parasite, which is difficult for those of us who write because we think we're enlightening the world and spreading knowledge. But some people see writers as a parasite, And a parasite, as you know, is something which takes but doesn't give. It's something that is selfish and self-centered and is not good for the cause. And the reason that writers might be such is because there's real problems out there. Who's going to fix the road? Who's going to fix the social issues? Who's going to, help the elderly? Who's going to get their hands dirty by helping fix problems? What do you mean you're in the library writing? What do you mean the world's on fire? How can you be How can you be reading and writing in this time? So some people are saying that. People from maybe outside of the university are saying that to those of us who are in these privileged elite, maybe ivory towers, which is a powerful challenge to those of us who are in the university that we have to grapple with, I think, and come up with an answer to, or we're going to ignore it. It's up to you. Right, look, this is a really bad, this is a really bad slide because it's got so many points. So I'm really sorry for that. But you know what I was going to say here, right? This is the last slide now. The next one is the summary. So I'm almost coming to the end. But this was a slide, right, which was supposed to be about intersectionality. And I was always conscious there was too much text, but I just thought, you know what? You're going to have to deal with it because this stuff's important and I didn't want to break it up. So just try and digest it, right? It's only this one time, I promise you. So look, this intersectionality, right? This slide is about intersectionality. And as you know, intersectionality is a term, we've used it so many times this morning. Intersectionality is a term that people who talk about decolonization are very comfortable with. It comes naturally to us because it's so important in our discussions. But what I wanted to do, and there's other literature that does similar things, is I wanted to try to say to you that if we really want to engage in a type of decolonial project, I think, and might be wrong, but I think that one of the principles of a decolonial outlook is being prepared to question and reconsider some of the assumptions that have, we have absorbed, right? And the reason I think that's important is because if you want to overcome something like racism or Eurocentrism, some of these things are so deeply embedded within us. And when I say us, I mean all of us. I don't mean just like people who are not in a university or people who are, not aware of decolonization. Like all of us, we have deeply embedded assumptions within us that are hard to shake off. But what I like, I suppose, about the decolonial approach is it tells us, I think, that you need to be prepared to question and challenge some of the things that you took for granted, that you thought was the only universal way of looking at the world, because there are other ways of thinking and there are other ways of knowing, and there are things that you don't even know exist out there. But if you kind of open your eyes, you'll become more aware that there are things going on that you hadn't even realized were going on. And if we follow that line of thinking, it makes us very critical thinkers, highly critical thinkers, to the extent that we start being critical of decolonial scholarship itself, but even of terms that are so dear to us. Like intersectionality, I tell my students, you can't finish a sociology degree. Like sometimes I meet them in third year and I say, so are you going to do intersectional analysis? Like what's intersectionality? I'm like, look, you can't finish a sociology degree without the word intersectionality being in your vocabulary. It's one of the most important terms for us. So we need that term so much. It's so important for our understanding of the world. But the decolonial perspective is going to help me to ask difficult questions about decolonization itself, but also about terms like intersectionality. And what some of the points that people are starting to talk about, or we might put in our own analysis, is asking questions like, okay, is intersectionality Eurocentric? That is a weird question because we thought we love intersectionality. I don't have any tattoos, but if I'm going to get a tattoo, it's going to have the word intersectionality in it. That's how important this term is to us. That's how much we love this term. We can't abandon. What do you mean? Leave intersectionality alone. We love intersectionality and we can't live without it. But this decolonial perspective might, if we use it properly, I think this is what's potentially exciting. This is why people got excited about decolonization, because it told people, look, there's other ways of thinking. There's other ways of imagining. You can ask difficult questions like, is intersectionality Eurocentric? For example, does discussions of intersectionality prioritize and privilege categories that are important and dominant in Western context at the expense of concepts and categories that are important in non-Western contexts? Are there terms? These are questions. I'm not saying like I have a strong position or the answers. I'm just trying to show you the point I'm trying to make. Are there terms other than intersectionality which are more conducive for helping us to understand the experiences of people in particular contexts that come rooted from those contexts, from those languages, from those spaces? In other words, is intersectionality like pretty good but not good enough? Is there more to be gleaned from looking at contexts that we don't usually look at? So these are weird questions to ask, and I'm not even sure how I feel about them. But I gave a conference presentation about this in more detail last year somewhere else, and I'm sorry I can't go through the points in more detail. But I think you get the point that I'm trying to make. The point is basically to say, if you want to enact a decolonial spirit, I think one of the key things that involves is asking questions about things that you take for granted, even things that you really don't know you take for granted and that you don't think you can question. And that's what decolonization is helping us to do. And it makes us ask uncomfortable questions. For example, another example, finally, just final example. Some people are activists in certain spaces, and they might feel really good about that. And I might say to them, listen, have you asked any uncomfortable questions about your activism? And they'd be like, what do you mean if I asked? I'm doing activism. How can I ask uncomfortable questions? It's amazing what I'm doing. I'm contributing. I'm making a difference. I'm speaking truth to power. Yes, but have you thought about the way in which such relations, such systems are reinforcing other inequalities that you've not considered, other types of harms that you've not considered, which might mean that what you're doing is not as grand and as fancy and as perfect as what you like to think. And I don't just apply this to others, I'm trying to also apply it to myself. But you get the point I'm trying to make. I'm heading towards this point of, as I've called it in one paper, decolonial reflexivity. And that's just basically saying, being cautious to not only point the blame elsewhere, but to think about our own positionality and how we relate to the injustices and the oppressions and the privileges as well, that are remnants of that colonial era or the era of coloniality. These are difficult questions, but if we're serious about this thing, if we really care about this stuff and we really want to do something, this is the territory that I think that we need to get into. So finally, in summary, I'm sorry, I think I spoke a bit longer than I should have. I just wanted to say that decolonization is a thing. It means different things. We got a sense of what it means. It's being attacked. Some people who are allies of decolonization are attacking it. It's vulnerable right now. It's being attacked from outside in the media, in the news media, in the social media, in politics that might increase in the future. It's being attacked like it's all these culture wars, and the article, it focuses on like the war against wokeness. Wokeness and decolonization is seen as a synonym for some people outside of the university. And so it's under attack. But I'm trying to be somewhat optimistic and say, I don't think we need to fully abandon it or give up on it yet. I think there are still things that can be done in different spaces, even though the things that we try to do, whether it's research or teaching, it's not perfect. It's not without its flaws and its limitations. And finally, I'm trying to say that one of the other things that we can retain from this decolonial perspective is that it might help us to ask questions and think through things that we might otherwise not have arrived at. Because when we start with Ali Ahmed, for example, or any other such thinkers of that era, the way that they were thinking in their time was original. It was challenging things that were taken for granted. To talk about the way that education was done at that time might seem obvious to us now, but at that time, maybe not many people were talking about it. And that's why those thinkers become so famous and so well known and respected and timeless, because they were at the forefront of thinking about what are the problems of today, how we're going to move forward. And that was why the other point that I was making earlier was that we should, all of us, should feel like we can do something to try to push forward the discussion, not letting the discussion stagnate. Because if the discussion about decolonization is vulnerable because it's under attack, it's also vulnerable because there's a danger and a risk of it stagnating. And the only way that won't happen and something can be salvaged from it is if those of us who are interested in this stuff try and do something about that by pushing along the narrative and looking at what is the next phase or the next chapter. So that's the challenge for you and for me and for all of us. I'm sorry that I spoke too much. Thank you very much for listening.